So first, welcome to the presentation of findings of the Self-Reliance Evidence Review. My name is Solène Dalga, and I am a Global Economic Recovery Advisor with the Danish Refugee Council. And today I will be moderating this event. As you continue coming, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, but please make sure you stay on mute throughout the event. We will have time for questions, so we would be very happy to for you to introduce them in the chat. The only thing that I will ask you is not to send questions directly to the speakers because they might not see them, but if you prefer sending them directly to me, that's totally fine. And one last technical point, we are recording the meeting today. Thanks. So I think we will begin. Rachel, if you can move to the next slide. Thank you so much. So why are you here? What is the Self-Reliance Evidence Review? It is, as far as we know, the first comprehensive review of resources on refugee self-reliance. It's a project that was undertaken in 2021 jointly by two organizations, Refuge Point and the Danish Refugee Council. For those of you who are familiar with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, this project actually builds upon the learning agenda, which outlines core questions about refugee self-reliance that partners of the initiative are encouraged to address in their work. Here I would like to make a quick but an important note. Here we are focusing on refugee self-reliance as we consider it an important outcome that we would like to work towards. However, we also recognize that self-reliance is not an appropriate goal for all persons of concern, and it cannot and should not replace the pursuit of durable solutions for all refugees. Today, we are presenting a selection of findings, as we thought it'd be useful to share the key conclusions of this project ahead of the Self-Reliance Roundtable on November 29th. This roundtable, as you probably know, is organized as part of the high-level official meeting taking place mid-December, which is a stock-taking event 2 years after the first Global Refugee Forum. We have decided to present a selection of findings, but the final brief that will be available and formally launched early next year will be much more detailed and present some of the findings that we're introducing today in greater details as well. Now, if we can move to the next slide and have a look at the agenda. So the first part of this event will be quite presentation heavy. We will introduce to you the background to the project, a selection of key findings, overarching recommendations, and also next steps and how we can continue the conversation. But hopefully we will still have some time at the end for a Q&A. And so really, I encourage you to include your question in the chat as we go, and we'll come back to them. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers, but we're also the co-authors of the Self-Reliance Evidence Review brief. We have Simar Singh, who is a senior program manager at Refuge Point, and also the agency lead for the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. Camille Strauss-Kahn is an economic recovery specialist with the Danish Refugee Council, and she's based out of Amman in Jordan. And Rachel Furlow, who is a graduate student at Georgetown University. So without further ado, I will turn to Simar, who will provide a more detailed introduction to the project.
Great, thank you so much, Solène. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. To start, I think as Solène mentioned, we all are here because we care about refugee self-reliance. Enhancing self-reliance for refugees is now one of the most prominent goals in humanitarian response. It's almost acquired buzzword status, whether that's positive or negative, but I think we all continue to hear more and more about self-reliance as an objective. And yet, as a community of practice working towards operationalizing this goal, we've been lagging behind in the evidence department. Without knowing what works best, where and for whom in self-reliance programming, let alone having a common understanding of what self-reliance encompasses and how to measure it, it's quite difficult to set feasible targets and know which program approaches to scale up in different contexts. So as a step towards building the evidence base, Refuge Point and the Danish Refugee Council have collaborated to undertake a knowledge mapping and assessment of existing research and evidence relating to self-reliance for refugees. We had three main objectives for this project. First, to consolidate and map what we do know from our collective experience supporting refugees to become self-reliant. Second, through that process, to identify program approaches that have proven to be effective in advancing self-reliance. And third, to identify what we don't yet know so that researchers and the wider community of practice can prioritize filling those evidence gaps. Refuge Point and the Danish Refugee Council are both members of the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. And as Selene mentioned at the outset, this project really builds on previous efforts undertaken by the initiative and contributes to its learning agenda. The methods used to produce the Self-Reliance Evidence Review were adapted from the Rapid Evidence Assessment methodology. The methodology we used consisted of 5 steps. First, defining research questions. Second, document sourcing through a structured search. Third, resource coding and mapping. Fourth, key informant interviews. And lastly, quantitative and qualitative analysis. We have more detailed information on the methodology that we would be happy to share with anyone who's interested in taking a closer look. The research team developed an initial list of research questions with the aim to capture to what extent existing evidence contributes to answering these questions. These questions were based on the RSRI learning agenda. And for each of the 6 main questions that are up on your screen, we outlined several sub-questions that really hone in on context and population-specific nuances and priority themes that we were interested in taking a closer look at. It's important to mention a number of considerations related to the scope of the project and limitations with the methodology. First, the evidence review only included resources that were available in the public domain. So it is not an exhaustive review of all resources and literature on the subject of refugee self-reliance. Second, the evidence review was limited to publications available in English. We know that we've therefore likely missed important contributions from non-Anglophone contexts, and more importantly, from local actors working across different contexts. Third, we focused on resources that were published between 2005 and going up till the first quarter of this year of 2021. We are aware that several relevant resources have been published after our cutoff date, especially ahead of the high-level meeting. So that's something we definitely acknowledge. And finally, it's important to emphasize that refugees are the primary focus of this research. We know that self-reliance programming is increasingly being undertaken for other displaced populations and for host communities. But in this review, we only considered evidence on other displaced populations insofar as they were mentioned in publications that focused on self-reliance and refugee populations, such as in comparative studies. The main outputs of this project are a living resource library of over 160 resources on refugee self-reliance, as well as a series of thematic evidence briefs, both of which will be formally launched early next year. We will continue to include relevant resources that missed the cutoff for the initial evidence review in the living library, and certainly invite contributions from all of you as we keep it updated. When designing this project, we really wanted to make sure that the evidence on self-reliance is made accessible to practitioners and is used to improve program design and decision-making to create better living standards for refugees. So it's really that orientation that has guided our design for the final outputs, really wanting to make them accessible to practitioners as well as researchers. Before moving on to the next section, I do want to, on behalf of the entire research team, thank colleagues from the Danish Refugee Council and Refuge Point, as well as the many experts who participated in key informant interviews and served as reviewers for this project, for being so generous with their time and really contributing to all of the work that we've produced. Before moving to sharing some of the key findings from the review, I do want to share some broad reflections on the state of the evidence based on what we found. So first, I already mentioned this, but it is worth noting that not all relevant evidence and learning on self-reliance is publicly available. We know that there is rich program data, information, and learning that is sitting in agency intranets and hard drives that has not been shared publicly. So that's certainly a finding from our review. It's also a little bit of a call to action to all of you to please share your data. And we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation as well. That said, for what we were able to access, we've compiled and reviewed over 160 publicly available documents published between 2005 and 2021. Of the documents that we compiled, about half were program documents, a third were research papers, and a sixth were policy papers, just to give you a sense of what made the cut with our criteria. Most of the documents that we considered in our review were case studies drawing on survey data. We found relatively few evaluations that drew on more sophisticated statistical analyses or bigger randomized control trials. We also saw about 5 times more content on self-reliance published in the last 5 to 6 years, between 2014 and 2021, compared to 2005 to 2013. So definitely in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot more content produced. This may not come as a surprise, but we did find that the research on self-reliance is heavily concentrated geographically, primarily in East Africa and the Middle East. And even within those contexts, Kenya, Uganda, and Jordan were overrepresented in the research. About a fifth of the documents we looked at discussed self-reliance globally without reference to a specific geography. Among those that did discuss cases in specific locations, 2/3 of the documents mentioned at least one case in East Africa. A third of the documents mentioned at least one case in the Middle East. Beyond that, it was actually only a third of the resources that we looked at that even mentioned a case outside of the Middle East and East Africa. And it was only 1/8 of the resources that focused exclusively on cases outside of those regions. So there's a very heavy geographical bias. We also found that the research represents a fairly small number of agencies and points of view. Almost 90% of the resources that we reviewed were published by about 10 to 15 agencies and individuals. So again, it's a very concentrated set of points of view that are represented in the research. And then finally, this is perhaps linked to one of the limitations of our research methodology, but we found very few resources that meaningfully incorporated refugee perspectives. While 3/4 of the resources reviewed include some survey data from refugees, only a fourth gave space to refugee voices and perspectives through quotes or key informant interviews. So that's a gap that we noticed in the research, and we'll come back to that later in the presentation as well. So I hope that that's whet your appetite for the rest of our findings. I'll stop here and turn it back to Selene. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simmer. And I think I will just give the floor to Rachel to present a selection of findings from the evidence review. Thank you.
Thank you, Selene. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today. I get to kick it off with our selected findings. So the first question that we addressed in our evidence review was how self-reliance is defined and understood in the literature. This included what are the most common definitions of self-reliance and what dimensions, whether that be economic, social, political, were focused on, and then how self-reliance was also defined at different levels. So there are a number of selected findings we want to present today. The first is that in the literature, we really found a lack of a shared understanding of what self-reliance is. So the concept of refugee self-reliance has evolved over the past 50 years, and there is increased interest in how to promote self-reliance for refugees, but the literature really did not demonstrate a shared understanding of what that means. Many resources that discuss self-reliance, even resources that discuss self-reliance at length, often referred to self-reliance without presenting a clear definition or a clear explanation of the term. In the policy papers reviewed, self-reliance was only defined in about a quarter of them, and self-reliance was only defined in 40% of the programmatic documents reviewed. This lack of definition then creates an ambiguity, and it often implicitly reduces the concept of self-reliance to one dimension, which is most commonly the economic dimension, which can influence the types of programs and policies that are then pursued. When self-reliance was defined in the literature, however, it's still defined in a number of different ways. Different stakeholders tend to focus on different aspects of self-reliance that are most aligned with their pre-existing kind of incentive structure and their positioning in regard to refugee responses. And so even when it is defined, we do see still a myriad of definitions and understandings of what self-reliance is. The second key finding is that, self-reliance, there's really consensus in recent literature that self-reliance is not complete independence. In policy-oriented documents, self-reliance is often defined as independence from external assistance. But, this lack of shared understanding of what self-reliance means has led to a lot of ambiguity and differing interpretations of what external assistance means. On one hand, some documents still define self-reliance as independence from all external support and emphasize reliance on market systems. But there is, really an increasing consensus in the literature that a refugee can be self-reliant and still rely on a variety of other support systems. But there's still a lot of discussions on what these systems include. For example, can refugees be self-reliant and still partially rely on international aid, or on remittances, or on national social service systems? These are a lot of the questions that are still being debated in the literature. The third selected finding is about the multidimensionality of how we define self-reliance. When there is a lack of definition or a lack of shared understanding of what self-reliance is, we often saw programmatic documents in the literature not fully explore kind of the multidimensionality of self-reliance. The most commonly cited definition was the 2005 UNHCR definition. It's very common, it's bidimensional, and highlights the economic and social aspects of self-reliance. However, there is still a strong tendency in the literature to either implicitly or explicitly focus solely on the economic dimension of self-reliance. That would be, livelihoods, income generation, employment. In fact, 25% of the documents that we reviewed that define self-reliance focused wholly on the economic dimension of self-reliance. However, there has been, an evolution in the literature that has increasingly focused more on the social, the political, and the legal dimensions of self-reliance in recent years. We found that after 2014, a majority of the documents that define self-reliance use a multi-dimensional definition. And in all of the documents that we reviewed, 85% of them that used a multi-dimensional definition were published after 2014. So this indicates, a really clear trend towards focusing more on the multidimensionality of what self-reliance is. And then the last selected finding is that, there's an increased focus on geographical self-reliance, as we like to call it. So most documents reviewed focused on self-reliance at maybe the individual or the household level, but there is an increasing recognition that self-reliance must be considered at a geographical level. So this is, in other words, the potential for self-reliance within a particular geographical area. And this stems from the argument that the potential for self-reliance of any individual, any household, community in a given area is directly dependent on the existence, health, and functionality of various existing support systems in the area. So for example, the potential for self-reliance is different for urban refugees in Jordan compared to refugees in the Dadaab camp in Kenya, for example, because the contexts are different. And that needs to be taken into account. So now I'll pass it on to our next section.
Thanks, Rachel. So the second thing that we've looked into across all the resources that we have curated is what self-reliance programming looked like in terms of program components and activities that are implemented, and also how these were combined into different types of program models or approaches. We've also looked into what evidence exists about which programs were successful in various contexts and for various population groups. So here are some of our findings on this specific topic. First, self-reliance programs are typically designed through a combination of economic and social inclusion components. But the actual activities that aim to increase social and economic inclusion for refugees and the ways in which they're combined vary from program to program. More specifically, what we found is that most self-reliance programs continue to focus primarily on economic inclusion. And they do so through various types of individual level, household level, community level interventions. And within economic inclusion programming, the literature still largely focuses on livelihoods interventions specifically. That said, in recent years, there is an increasing emphasis on 2 points. First, that not all livelihoods interventions for refugees are necessarily conducive to self-reliance, but only good livelihoods programming, that is to say, interventions that are market-based and aim at providing decent, sustainable, and diversified livelihoods for refugees. Second, while livelihoods interventions are widely considered to be a central and even a necessary component of self-reliance programming, it is not a sufficient one. In other words, the literature increasingly recognizes that there are first other essential aspects to economic inclusion than just livelihoods, including, for example, financial inclusion or consumption support, but also that on top of economic inclusion, there is a need for specific social inclusion programming to achieve better self-reliance outcomes. Although to some extent, the nuances between different types of social inclusion program components are not necessarily spelled out in as much details in the current literature. And that's a point I'll be happy to get back to during the Q&A if you're interested. The second finding here is that we found in the literature increasing recognition that beyond individual, household, community level programming, there is also a need for system level interventions and support of refugee self-reliance. And more specifically, system level interventions that affect the policy environment and the macroeconomic environment in which refugees live. Concretely, the literature calls for complementing social and economic inclusion programming with advocacy for more inclusive policy frameworks for refugees, as well as with interventions that consider more generally the local economic development of refugee hosting areas. So in a sense, while social and economic inclusion interventions can help reduce the gap in self-reliance between refugee populations and their host, these system-level interventions contribute, on the other hand, to increasing overall the level of self-reliance that refugees can achieve in a given context. So you can see that this is to some extent related to the point that Rachel just made on geographical self-reliance. The third finding that we want to emphasize today, and which to some extent is related to this idea that self-reliance programming requires system-level change, is that the literature insists on the fact that self-reliance programming depends upon the capacity and the responsibility of multiple stakeholders that include humanitarian actors, but also local authorities, the private sector, civil society, and development actors. So for example, a great number of resources emphasize the essential role that local authorities have in making the legal and policy environment for refugees more inclusive and more permissive, in particular with regard to the right to work or freedom of movement. Similarly, while refugee response has to some extent long been seen as a responsibility of humanitarian actors, there is also a clear emphasis in the literature on the role that development actors have to play in fostering the local economic development of refugee hosting areas, and for example, by ensuring that foreign aid actually flows to these regions, and by working with local authorities to ensure that national development plans take the needs of these areas into account. But finally, especially in recent years, there is more and more systematic mention in the literature of a specific role for the private sector and for civil society with regard to refugee self-reliance. And specifically mentioned of the need to engage with them in refugee self-reliance programming in various ways. And again, I'm happy to expand a little bit on these ideas in the Q&A. The last point I will make in terms of our findings on self-reliance programming is that self-reliance programs are implemented in a vast array of displacement contexts. So you have self-reliance programs in camps and out of camps, in rural and in urban contexts, as well as in different socio-economic contexts, be it low-income settings or middle-income settings, and in more or less restrictive policy contexts. Similarly, self-reliance programming is also implemented for a wide variety of target populations that have very different characteristics, like women, youth, the elderly, people with disabilities, ultra-poor refugees, but also highly skilled refugees. And one important takeaway from the literature is that context matters. And by that, I mean that all these factors influence how self-reliance programs should be designed and what works. However, we also noticed in the current literature that findings about what works are not segmented by context. We haven't found, for example, any large-scale cross-country comparisons and relatively few comparative case studies. One exception to that remark is maybe a few comparative case studies that look into the effects of more or less restrictive policy environments. But overall, as a result, it can be difficult to extract from the current literature best practices by context. And this point we will explore in a bit more details in the research gap sections. Similarly, we have found little research about self-reliance programming that focuses on specific population subgroups, such as self-reliance for women, or self-reliance for youth, or for people with disabilities specifically. The only exception to that is maybe some substantial evidence around self-reliance programming targeted at ultra-poor refugees. This specifically is discussed in documents that focus on the graduation approach, which is one very specific approach to self-reliance programming that is targeted at that very specific target group, that is the ultra-poor. And it so happens that in our collection of resources, the graduation approach is the most commonly studied single program model that we found. So with about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 resources that specifically discusses the graduation approach. So overall, there is both increased recognition that self-reliance program components need to be systematically adapted and tailored to specific populations and their circumstances. But at the same time, considering overall the wealth of information that is available, there is still relatively little indications available about how to concretely do it. And Simar, I'll hand over to you for another selection of findings on measuring self-reliance.
Great, thank you, Camille. One of the research topics our evidence review focused on is the measurement of self-reliance. Specifically, we looked at how self-reliance is currently being measured, what measurement tools and frameworks exist, and how measurement can be improved. So some of the findings from our review, I'll share a selection right now. First, in our review, we found that most resources only made a passing reference to measuring self-reliance, usually highlighting the need to create robust measures and also acknowledging the complexity of doing so. However, far fewer resources actually proposed concrete ways in which to measure self-reliance. That said, in the last few years, there have been some promising attempts to bridge this measurement gap, notably through the Self-Reliance Index developed by the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative and through research undertaken by the Refugee Economies Program at the University of Oxford. We also found that resources in the literature that did focus on measuring self-reliance usually aimed to evaluate 2 separate but related aspects. First, resources focused on measuring the level of self-reliance of an individual or a household, or less frequently of a community, And second, resources focused on measuring the conditions that enable or impede the achievement of self-reliance within a specific location. These two aspects respond to linked goals. The former relates to evaluating the effectiveness of a self-reliance intervention or program, and the latter relates to assessing how conducive conditions within a specific location are to enabling self-reliance. But given that these are different objectives, the approaches taken to measuring these different aspects of self-reliance were also quite different. We did find in some research that both of these aspects, looking at the self-reliance status of a refugee household or individual, as well as examining the broader conditions in the context, were used and assessed concurrently to get a full picture. But that was really in a minority of resources. We also found broadly that there's a disconnect between what we aim to measure and what is actually being measured when looking at self-reliance. This came out in three ways in the resources that we reviewed. First, the vast majority of self-reliance programs in the resources reviewed do not use tools or conceptual frameworks that have been specifically developed to measure or evaluate refugee self-reliance. Instead, most used project-specific indicators that were selected as proxies for self-reliance, such as levels of income, number of job placements, or access to basic services. While these indicators measure the results of individual program interventions, they provide an incomplete picture of the self-reliance standing of a refugee, which is dependent on numerous interdependent factors. As mentioned previously, there are recent promising efforts to create direct measures that are multidimensional to measure self-reliance, the most prominent one being the Self-Reliance Index. Second, while there is general agreement in the literature that the household is the most appropriate unit for analysis when measuring self-reliance, we found that most indicators used to measure self-reliance are actually at the individual level. Again, this is because most self-reliance programs typically rely on project-specific indicators for their evaluation, which usually only reflect the specific interventions carried out by that implementing agency. And many of these interventions are targeted at individuals, such as education programs, skill development programs, or support for income-generating activities. However, when assessing self-reliance, it is important to look beyond the individual and also measure the impact on the wider household. And finally, we found that self-reliance is typically measured in line with 6 or 12-month humanitarian program cycles, usually at the baseline and/or at the end line. However, these short program cycles are not well aligned with the longer timeframes that are typically needed to observe changes in self-reliance outcomes. And they may not adequately track the progression of refugees towards achieving self-reliance. In addition, since self-reliance is understood as transitioning off dependence on aid, it is important to measure the self-reliance status of a household, particularly extending past the end of a project cycle to understand the sustainability of results. We found very few systematic efforts to measure self-reliance in the months following the end of a program intervention. So to sum up, for the findings on measurement, it was interesting to see that this was one area where we both noted one of the biggest gaps in the literature in terms of concrete proposals to measure self-reliance. At the same time, really towards the tail end of the time period that we were reviewing, we also found this to be one of the areas where there has been the most concerted and significant effort to fill the gap. So, we sort of left on an optimistic note. We do know sort of from practice that there are many agencies that are moving towards multidimensional indicators, many agencies that are starting to incorporate the Self-Reliance Index in their programs. That is newer, and so we haven't seen as much of a reflection in the literature of those trends. But we did note that there is sort of positive movement in this area. I'll end there and hand it over to Rachel.
Actually, I think
Okay.
I take the next one. Thank you, Tamar. So another aspect that we've looked into systematically in our review of the literature is related to the costs of self-reliance programs and more broadly to the funding environment and the value for money of such approaches. So I present here just two of our main findings around that. And let me say first that overall, this is a topic on which we haven't found as much information as we expected that we would. So the first finding that I want to emphasize here is that around self-reliance programming and funding, we found that many resources actually discuss self-reliance programming with regard to funding. About 1 in 4 resources overall include comments about the funding environment, and that statistic raises up to 1 in 2 programmatic documents. But in fact, it's not necessarily discussed in the way that we expected. We have found relatively few resources that actually discuss the sources and characteristics of funding for self-reliance programming specifically. Most of them discuss trends like the shrinking of humanitarian funding in general and the increased duration of displacement as an argument that seemingly increases the relevance of self-reliance programming compared to other types of programming for refugees. That said, among the resources that do discuss specifically the funding of self-reliance programs, there is one point that is consistently mentioned, and that is worth highlighting here, which is the misalignment in terms of timelines between humanitarian funding cycles and the implementation of self-reliance programs, the achievement of self-reliance objectives, or as Samar just mentioned, the measurement of self-reliance outcomes. The second theme that comes up in the literature around the financing of self-reliance programming is related to the value for money of such programs. So we have found that in many resources, self-reliance programming is implicitly assumed to have better value for money than other types of humanitarian programs. But we haven't been able to locate resources that base this argument on concrete evidence, or even so many that spell out the logic of this argument very explicitly. So more specifically, overall, we found relatively little information about the costs of self-reliance programming, except again for a specific subset of documents that focus on the graduation approach. But even there is in general information available about the value for money of graduation approach programs, but not so much specifically in displacement context. The other thing that we've noted around the value for money of self-reliance programs are that first, when the value for money is discussed, it usually is conceptualized as cost efficiency, which is a short-term measure. And second, that self-reliance programming is implicitly then compared to other types of humanitarian programs for refugees, such as typically care and maintenance programs. But we haven't found in-depth reflections about the fact that, for example, cost efficiency is a short-term measure that is not necessarily relevant or appropriate when discussing the value for money of self-reliance programs, which have, by essence, a long-term logic. And so maybe not the best measure to compare them to other types of humanitarian programs for refugees. So once again, I stop there and I'd be happy to elaborate on these points in our Q&A, and I'll hand over to Rachel.
Thank you, Camille. I get to close us out with a discussion on some of the research gaps that we found that have been touched on a little bit in the presentation, but I want to go into a bit more depth on a couple of them. So one primary research gap that we found was the lack of diversity in the voices discussing self-reliance and also the examples of self-reliance programming that are discussed. And Samar and Camille did touch on this in their presentations, but again, the evidence review identified very few attempts to incorporate perspectives of refugees themselves when defining and discussing self-reliance. As we said, only a quarter, 25% of the resources found were classified as including significant contributions from refugees themselves. And then there were also very few resources from refugee-led organizations, local organizations, or even a diverse group of international organizations. As we note, the former may be due to the fact that the evidence review was limited to English sources, but it still prompts a really important discussion on the current gaps in the literature, on whose voices are being heard, and how that impacts how we define and understand self-reliance. And then these gaps are in addition to what Samar mentioned earlier about the lack of geographic diversity in terms of the regions most examined in the literature. The second major gap that we found was the lack of connections between self-reliance and other prominent thematic areas, especially issues like climate change and localization that are becoming increasingly important and increasingly discussed in the field. But there was very little discussion on connecting these concepts and these challenges with self-reliance. For climate change, for example, some resources mention natural disasters or environmental changes as external shocks that could affect resilience and impede self-reliance, but there was very little in-depth discussion on how to avoid these external shocks or what types of self-reliance may be disproportionately impacted, for example, rural programs, agricultural programs. For localization, there were very few discussions linking self-reliance with the localization agenda, despite an increasing focus on localization within the sector. For resources that did touch on localization, it really focused on how international organizations should coordinate self-reliance programming with national organizations or institutions or kind of develop responsibility, but there were very few details on what this looks like in reality. And it failed to address a lot of potential questions, such as whether refugee self-reliance is about sharing or shifting the burden to refugee hosting countries or even refugees themselves. So there needs to be more discussion connecting self-reliance with some of these important challenges and thematic areas. The third primary gap we found was the lack of discussion around self-reliance and specific durable solutions. There was substantial discussion on how self-reliance relates to durable solutions in general, albeit with a tension between presenting self-reliance as a preparatory step to durable solutions or as a substitute when durable solutions programming is not feasible. But we were very surprisingly few discussions on the articulation between self-reliance and specific durable solutions, including local integration, but also resettlement and voluntary return. And this was, a very surprising gap for us as the research team, because this is such a critical topic and kind of the inherent link between self-reliance and durable solutions overall. The third primary gap that we want to bring out today was something Camille touched on a bit, and it's really, the lack of research on self-reliance programming for diverse population groups. So this could be, IDPs, women, youth, people with disabilities. We really expected more literature focusing on how self-reliance could be achieved for these specific population groups. But there was really very little meaningful discussion on it. And I'm going to talk specifically about refugees and IDPs and also the gendered aspect of self-reliance. So while this project did not specifically review literature on IDPs, there were still really very few resources that compared refugee self-reliance programs with IDPs and self-reliance. And comparing self-reliance for refugees and IDPs can really help clarify which barriers to self-reliance are related to displacement itself and which are related more specifically to the legal framework related to cross-border asylum. In turn, this can really help inform self-reliance programming. So it would be critical to have more discussion and more comparison on self-reliance for refugees versus IDPs. And then the second population group that there was, little specific research on was the gendered aspect of self-reliance. So there were very few resources in the self-reliance literature that specifically address gender considerations in self-reliance programming. Overall, there was little evidence on the best practices in gendered self-reliance programming or why specific program interventions are targeted to specific gender groups. And then there was also, little evidence on the unintended consequences of gendered self-reliance programming that specifically targets women. So these are just kind of a number of the main research gaps that we found that would all benefit from additional focus and additional research to continue expanding and understanding how self-reliance can work. So now I will pass it back.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel, Camille, and Simar for the presentation of these selected findings. As I mentioned before, there is much more. I know it's hard to believe, but there is much more in the brief that will come out early next year. So now, taking this in, we would like today to share some selected recommendations. Again, not covering all of what we would recommend as a group, but still, I think it's interesting at this point already to highlight a couple of recommendations. So over to you, Simar.
Thank you, Selene. So through this project, we really want to make sure that the evidence informs practice, and that in turn, practice continues to inform evidence. So it's really in that spirit that we developed some recommendations to accompany our findings from the review. And as Selene mentioned, we are happy to share a selection of those recommendations with all of you today. So the first set of recommendations relate to programming and policies. And first, we note that refugee perspectives are conspicuously absent from much of the literature on self-reliance, and yet refugees themselves are best placed to identify the changes necessary to improve their well-being and the ability to support themselves. Implementing agencies should include the voices and perspectives of refugees when designing, implementing, assessing, and discussing policies, programs, and tools to improve refugee self-reliance. Second, when designing programs and policies and strategies to measure their impact, it is critical for implementing agencies to systematically consider the various dimensions of self-reliance and the different levels at which change can be effective. This really draws on some of the points that we made in our findings from the programming section of our review, where we recognized that there are a lot of resources that look at only one aspect of self-reliance, or only focus on programming focused on one level, not looking at sort of the systems change level, for example. So we really call on implementing agencies to consider all aspects of self-reliance, social, economic, and beyond that, but also the different levels at which change can be made. Third, we recommend that donors should create funding tools that support the types of programming that are needed to foster and sustain self-reliance for refugees. This includes flexible multi-year funding for programs that cut across the many traditional sectors of humanitarian response. This is something that came through very strongly in our research findings. That to a large extent, it's financing and funding mechanisms for humanitarian programs that are not well aligned with what's really needed in the types of programming to help refugees become self-reliant. So we really hope for the donors in the room that there's more that you can do to adapt your financing mechanisms to support self-reliance programming. Next, we have a set of recommendations related to evidence and learning. First, given that there are varying understandings and definitions of what self-reliance means and what it encompasses, we strongly recommend that all stakeholders should explicitly define self-reliance when using the term. This will be a start to help set feasible targets and goals for enhancing self-reliance, to track progress and promote collaboration between implementing agencies. We do note that even in the Global Compact on Refugees, in the document itself, there isn't a clear definition for self-reliance, but we do know that that's something that came through in the indicator framework. And I believe that someone actually shared that definition in the chat. So, we really recommend, especially for high-level efforts, but even, sort of for programs or research documents, while as a broader sector, we move towards a common understanding. If you use the term, please define it. Next, designing programs and implementing programs and policies that promote better self-reliance outcomes for refugees really require knowledge and evidence on what works. That's sort of the basis for this project, and I think why a lot of us are here today. So we call on all stakeholders, and that includes all of you on this call today, to commit to sharing the results of your evaluations and assessments, whether they are more or less successful, and to share the lessons that you've learned along the way, so that we can collectively leverage and build on this knowledge to scale up what works and invest in making improvements where there is more work to be done. And finally, we recommend that donors support the generation of robust evidence on what works to help refugees become and stay self-reliant, including by funding self-reliance monitoring efforts beyond the end of a program intervention, and by filling research gaps, including cross-country comparisons and research on the broader impact of increased self-reliance efforts on refugees and host communities. So again, this is sort of a taste of some of the recommendations that we have in our review. We have thematic recommendations based on each of the briefs that will be available once the briefs are out. But we did want to share some of these broader recommendations and call to actions for those of you who joined this call. We'll also be compiling these and sharing them ahead of the roundtable on self-reliance next week and the meetings at the high-level officials meeting next month. So thank you, and over to Camille on the next steps.
Thanks a lot, Simar. So with this presentation today, we wanted to make sure that we would have an opportunity to share this information with all of you ahead of the Self-Reliance Roundtable next week. But we also see this research project very much as a conversation starter, as a first step to engage in much broader conversations about self-reliance in the future. And so, as you can see on this slide, our next steps in this project and our dissemination plan extends all the way into 2022. First, we will release a short document on December 6th, so exactly 1 week before DHLOM, with consolidated findings and recommendations from the entire study, including the highlights that we have presented today, but also others. The 7 thematic evidence briefs will be finalized by the end of the year and officially released in early January alongside the online living library. Among those briefs, there's going to be one around defining self-reliance, 2 around programming self-reliance, so one focused on program components and approaches, and the other on programming in specific contexts and for specific populations. There's going to be a thematic brief on the measurement of self-reliance, and there's going to be one on the financing of self-reliance. There's also going to be a brief on achieving self-reliance that is going to look more in depth around the impact and outcomes of self-reliance programming. And finally, there's going to be one around all the research gaps that we have identified. In addition to that, we'll obviously also release a detailed brief that looks into the methodology that we've used and all its limitations. And from that point on, our objective will be to organize a series of events and discussions throughout the first quarter of 2022 with various stakeholders to engage on what is not currently covered by the literature on self-reliance that we have reviewed. So for example, we want to engage in discussions with like-minded organizations that have been undertaking work on similar topics to see how their findings complement or nuance ours, but also with refugee-led organizations, since we have found that their perspective was not well represented in our sample, as well as another example, with organizations that undertake programming for refugees in geographies that were not covered by this study, like resettlement countries, for example. So please keep an eye out for more information about these events in the coming weeks and months, and let us know if there's a particular interest of yours in a specific discussion. And overall, we really look forward to engaging further with many of you in the future on these topics.
Camille, you're on mute, but I will take over from here. Thank you so much to the 3 of you for the presentation of our findings. Now we have enough time, which is pretty amazing for an in-depth Q&A. So thank you for giving time and making this happen. And because we have enough time, I will ask people who have written their questions in the chat or who want to ask other questions if they can unmute and ask the question themselves. So I will first turn to Justin, who had a question about measurement and also type of programs. Justin, would you like to ask your question to the group?
Yeah, thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm Justin from African Entrepreneur Perspective based in Rwanda, Kigali. So I have two questions. I was asking for an organization that is supporting entrepreneurs with business development skills and access to finance, or what are the key metrics or the key indicators that the organization may use to measure self-reliance, and also if you, based on your research, how long does it take for those entrepreneurs to become self-reliant? Thank you.
So a question around key metrics to measure self-reliance, I think that goes naturally to Simmer.
Thank you, Solène. And thank you, Justin, for your question. So the question, I think, was really about, the key metrics for self-reliance, and also whether we've been able to find any information on typically how long it takes for refugees to become self-reliant. So maybe on your first question, Justin, I would say that one of the things that's come through pretty strongly from the findings is that there are many interdependent factors that go into improving outcomes, self-reliance outcomes for refugee families. So self-reliance is really sort of, about the broader economic stability of a family, the health status, the nutrition status of the family, whether children are in school and able to have access to education, and whether there's a broader sense of safety and being connected socially. So really, in order to assess the self-reliance status of a refugee household, what we found is that we want to get a look at the broader holistic picture of how a family is doing. And this is important to note because it's really regardless of what type of program intervention any agency might be conducting. So to your question, you sort of mentioned, specifically if there's a livelihoods program, are there specific metrics that we would want to use? So through the evidence review, and a lot of this also draws particularly on the work that the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative has done over years to create a measurement tool, the Self-Reliance Index. So really drawing on a lot of that information as well. Sort of what we would say is that first, regardless of the type of program that you're conducting, if you are interested in understanding the self-reliance status of a refugee household, it is important to look at a broad range of multi-dimensional indicators. The Self-Reliance Index, for example, looks at a number of different areas. It looks at housing, at health status, at food, education, safety, employment, financial resources, savings, social capital, and a number of others. So it's really a broad range of indicators. So that's sort of the recommendation that we're coming to, is that in addition to any project-specific indicators that you might be using, such as the level of income earned or employment status, it is important to understand self-reliance to look at that broader set of indicators. The second piece that I'll mention that's related is that it's also important to measure self-reliance over time. Measuring at a particular point in time will give you a snapshot of how a family is doing, but it doesn't help explain the trajectory or the pathway to achieving self-reliance. And so along with looking at a holistic or broader range of indicators, it's also helpful and actually quite crucial to measure self-reliance over time. This is another thing that the Self-Reliance Index was very much designed to do. And maybe we can put a link in the chat. I can do that in a minute to the index where you can get a bit more information. And also just to measure, the Self-Reliance Index is one attempt to do this, but it's really the result of a number of years of effort to try and answer the exact question that you had. On the second one, in terms of how long it takes, the jury is still out on that. I think, going back to some of the findings that we presented, the one thing that's clear is that it really is context specific. How long it takes for a refugee or a refugee household to attain self-reliance is a combination of conditions within the specific context. It's based on the needs of that specific refugee or refugee family. And so it's really, I think we're going to be hard pressed to come up with an exact time frame. But if you do have a cohort of refugees that have similar needs, over time, if you measure, their progress towards self-reliance, you might start to get a bit of an understanding of what that may look like for a specific refugee population in a specific context. But it's not going to be possible to get an average number globally. So I hope that answered your question, and happy to clarify further if useful.
Sarah, you're not going to be off the hook just right now, just now, because we have a follow-up conversation on measurement, if that's okay. Rose, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I just had a question in terms of when you were reviewing the different briefs, did you find that any specific programs were specifically trying to measure at the onset of a shock or amidst a shock or after? Because I would imagine that these would be critical time periods. And of course we have COVID that just happened, but I guess I'm thinking like a drought, something that you would have an early warning system. Yeah, just curious to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rose. I don't think we saw, I'm trying to make sure I answer this accurately. There's nothing that comes to mind where we sort of specifically saw measurement efforts at the outset of a specific shock. That said, we did start seeing some research coming in on COVID, most of which was not really included in our evidence review. So I will sort of keep that as one exception. What we did find instead was that a lot of programs or program responses or program interventions that were usually developed in response to an emergency or in response to some sort of event did measure, sort of at the baseline or at the end line. So a lot of the programs were perhaps created in response to a shock, but we didn't see anything that was, there's nothing that comes to mind that was specifically undertaken in response to an emergency. I'm not sure if that was clear.
I think it was very clear. Thank you. Thank you so much, Timur. I don't know, Rose, if you had any follow-up.
No, that's very clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rose. And now I will turn to Ermi's questions on the impact of refugee self-reliance. So as Camille mentioned, there will be a specific brief on achieving self-reliance that will focus on impact. So Ermi, if you can read out your question, and then I turn the answer to Camille. Thank you.
Sure. My question was a little bit different. So it actually went off of the finding for the need for system level programming and programming that ultimately affects the policy environment. And so the question I had is that when we're thinking about system level programming, what are some of the findings, or if there are any findings on the impact of these programs on more of like the meso or macro level? So thinking about the local economy, any market disruptions, are there any spillover effects on the host community? So I'm not sure what is out there, but I'm curious to know if you found anything, or organizations or different publications doing work on that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the question, Ermi. And that is indeed a topic that we're going to discuss in that brief on the impact of self-reliance on other key elements that we care about, and on self-reliance outcomes. And that's going to be the brief on achieving self-reliance. So to your question, actually, we found surprisingly little evidence on the impact of self-reliance in terms, for example, of contribution of refugees to local economies, be it local systems or at the broader like macro level national economies. And that is one of the gaps that we identify compared to the initial research questions that we set to answer at the beginning of this research project. More specifically, to your point about system level interventions and the existing evidence about system level outcomes that may or may not be achieved through self-reliance programming, I guess to some extent, Samar might talk a little bit more about in terms of measurement, also the limitations or the difficulties that exist in terms of measuring contribution and attribution in system level interventions of that sort. But more to evidence in the literature on the impact of self-reliance programming, we found some documents that mention expectations about potential spillover effects to local host populations. And those spillovers can be framed either positively or negatively, as you rightly emphasized. But by contrast, we haven't found concrete evidence or measurement of such impacts or effects. The only discussion overall in terms of the impact of self-reliance programming that is more fleshed out in the literature is around the link between self-reliance programming and durable solutions, with the caveat that Rachel mentioned in the presentation about specific individual solutions being not explored in details. So I think to your question then, the piece of the literature in which we find the most information is around looking at how social inclusion programming and those types of activities are described. But then we move a little bit away from your initial questions, because those activities are usually either individual level or household level, or actually in that case, more generally community level interventions, but not necessarily interventions that aim at influencing system level areas. So either the policy environment, as you mentioned, or we could think about the level of local economic development. And if we look at social inclusion programming, there is an interesting link that is made increasingly around the need for activities that improve refugee self-reliance through increasing their social capital, and activities that increase refugee self-reliance through increasing the level of social cohesion with host communities. So both social capital-based activities and social cohesion-centered activities are thought to foster the achievement of self-reliance outcomes for refugees. Again, implicitly, with framing that can consider around social capital mostly positive spillover effects, and around social cohesion activities mostly negative spillover effects where the intervention is not put in place. In terms of then looking into those specific activities, I would say that the most successful practices that are highlighted in the literature, was the caveat again that because of the lack of context segmentation in the way the literature is presented, it's really hard to really highlight specific best practices for specific contexts and cases. But some of the practices that are highlighted are around the mobilization of civil society at large through cross-cutting groups that involve both refugee populations and local host populations in specific contexts. And it seems to appear more in rural context, but that's something we discussed with a bit more nuance in one of the programming briefs. There's a lot of those activities around social cohesion with host communities that are centered around the management of natural resources. And there specifically, it seems that the use of techniques of conflict-sensitive communications have proven in several different instances quite successful. So I hope to some extent that that addresses your question, even though more broadly, the frame is we found a lot less evidence specifically related to that point than we expected to.
Yes, thank you. That's super helpful. And yeah, and thank you. I think that it just shows the need for organizations to do work on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I move to the next question, I just want to acknowledge that Rose in the chat shared a couple of resources already. Great move that we can use and build upon, but basically that looks specifically at how Self-Reliance is evolving, or specifically in the context of a graduation program in Uganda before COVID, and as people continue facing shocks and difficulties and stresses since the beginning of the crisis. Now I would like to turn to Amy, who has a question around definition and how and when it had evolves in the literature, and I will turn the question to Rachel for answer. Thanks. Amy?
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for the presentation. I'm not sure to what extent, I think this might be outside of the scope, but I was just curious in reviewing all of this literature, if you had a sense of how and why definitions were shifting from those that were more economic focused to ones that were more multidisciplinary, comprehensive, focused more on social inclusion. I'm just curious what some of the impetus for that was, if you noticed.
Sure, I think that's a really interesting question, and something that should be tracked as we look at what self-reliance means and how us as a practitioner community kind of view self-reliance. I think, as you said, there's a very clear kind of trend towards moving away from the strictly economic definition or economic aspect of self-reliance towards the social, legal, political aspects, especially as we saw since the mid-2010s. Speaking, I'm sure there are more resources out there that we can guide you to, but I think a lot of this is due to an overall trend in the sector that moves towards more nuanced kind of perspectives on how we view humanitarian responses, and not just as an economic condition, but rather as something that, as Camille discussed, context matters. And I think that's becoming more and more prominent in how we address some of these refugee crises and just general humanitarian crises, and that it's not simply a one-size-fits-all, and looking at the context and therefore looking at the social, the political, the legal aspects of self-reliance and of these responses is critical.
Thank you, Rachel. Amy, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
I will just acknowledge one question in the chat that is around geographies and whether we plan to publish or to develop briefs that are more geographically specific. I think the short answer is no. In terms of the brief for this specific review, but as we said, or several times was said during this presentation, some geographies are actually very well researched, and if you have a specific interest in these geographies, we can also point you to the relevant resources. And conversely, also as discussed, some geographies are not at all covered, and we have very little information for them. I hope that answers your question. And then I will.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it does. Okay, thanks, Michelle. Camille, you want to add something before I move to the next question?
on that question, and more generally on the living library or resources. So in addition to the thematic evidence briefs, we've also mapped the resources that we have curated across quite large set of variables, including the geographies that they speak about. So that's part of the point of this living library or resources online. You're going to be able to filter the set of resources that speak to specific things. And it can be specific geography. So you're going to be able to filter the resources that speak specifically about Kenya or that speak about East Africa more generally. You're going to be able to filter the resources that speak about the graduation approach or that speak about the funding of self-reliance more specifically. So when we release that library, you're going to be able to kind of have this bibliography on specific geographies that is readily available to you, including a mapping of the contents of these resources. And hopefully that's going to help kind of further advance our understanding of self-reliance and self-reliance programmings and related problematics in specific geographies.
Thanks, Cami. And we really looking forward to the library. I think it's going to be a great resource. Kane, I think you've had your hand up for quite some time. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much for a great presentation and discussion. I joined a little bit late. My name is Kahin Ismail. I'm the new head of Self-Reliance and Inclusion section of UNHCR in Geneva. But I just arrived actually 3 weeks ago. So I'm not owning that title, but my comments are informed by the fact that I was until a month ago head of office in Kakuma in Kenya, where as we work with many of you on the ground, and as you know, is one of the operations globally, you could say, that is most advanced in terms of socioeconomic inclusion of refugees and host community in that area. So I'm very glad to hear the fact that we are emphasizing in the findings and in the gaps as well that that self-reliance measurement has to be multidimensional and holistic in that sense, because otherwise just focusing on the economic aspect of it is really quite limiting. As you may know, in Kakuma, we have a multi-year, multi-stakeholder area development approach called KISIDEP, Kakuma or Kalobeye Integrated Socioeconomic Development Plan, that has been now in its, I think, 4th year in Kakuma. It is a process led by the government with the host community and development actors, humanitarian actors as well. So it is very, very much what we are discussing in terms of how to approach it. I think it has to be a holistic approach in that sense, because otherwise you cannot really talk about or measure even a self-reliant if you don't talk about all the other aspects of inclusion that are the bedrock and in fact the foundation for achieving a self-reliance as well. The two are not exclusive. In fact, they have to be in the same approach of how we do that. So I'm very glad to see that. I think the aspects of you mentioned on the refugee voices missing from the literature, but also from the study, is really important to look into that. Because it's only talking to the refugees themselves that you can find out whether the interventions and the programs that we have been implementing on the ground are succeeding. And another way to bring in the voices of refugees, as Camille was mentioning, is also to measure the economic refugee contribution in the host community. And as you know, in Kakuma, in the build up to the KISIDEP framework, there were very important studies done by the World Bank as well. The one was called Yes in My Backyard, and another one called Kakuma as a Marketplace. that really showcased and showed the host community and the local authorities who were skeptical at the beginning in terms of the whole inclusion and socio-development approach for refugees host community, because as you know, Kakuma and the Dadaab camps have been in existence for 30 years. The first 25 years were basically care and maintenance camps, but we have, at least in the Kakuma context, moved away significantly from that. And you can see the shift in approach and the dividend also for the host community. So I think it is important to not only include the refugees, but also the host communities hosting refugees in that, and now we see the support and the inclusive approach for both refugees and host community in the context of Kakuma. So I think it is important that our studies and literature really reflect not only the voices of the refugees, but also the host community to really have a good pulse and measurement of the development in that sense. On the issue of financing self-reliance, and that is really very important as well, because as mentioned also in the presentation, this has to be a long-term approach. And as you know, humanitarian funding is a yearly cycle. So it really doesn't work in that sense. And that's why obviously the multi-stakeholder approach also involves the development actors as well, who have a bit of a long-term and maybe different and flexible financing mechanisms in these things, because we have seen the limitations. And even in Kakuma, where we think we are advanced in the collaboration and the multi-year stakeholder approach, still I would say 80% of the financing, even for the host community, is through the humanitarian funding stream. And that has to obviously change. And then we talk about humanitarian development nexus. How do you transition from humanitarian financing, humanitarian approach to more development for the area, for the host community included as well? But the financing aspect is very important to look into that as well, because you really cannot program for self-reliance or inclusion, socioeconomic development in an area for refugees and host community on a humanitarian budget, which is really diminishing on the one hand, but also unreliable in terms of the funding itself. So that is one of the pitfalls, and that is one of the things that obviously needs to be worked out in terms of the nexus between humanitarian and development. So I will stop there for now, but thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. And yes, the gaps and the recommendations are really eye-opening as well, and how we can get that. I think there are a lot of literature out there, more and more literature coming online as well, including from UNHCR. So I think it is good also to cross-fertilize and cross-reference these things and in our approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kahin, and it's great to hear these key messages from you. And I hope maybe you can also be an advocate of some of the recommendations and findings in the Self-Reliance Roundtable next week. But really, we hope that this can be useful and can travel through some of these discussions towards the end of the year and obviously into 2022. But thanks so much for sharing some of your reflection also from very concrete experience from Kakuma. I know we are pushing the end of this presentation, but I would like to take one last question from Sarah, if that's okay, and ask Camille to maybe speak to it. Sarah?
Oh, good afternoon. Yes, thank you very much. I just wondered if you had come across anything in the literature around natural capital, natural resources, ecosystem health in refugee self-reliance. I mean, it's not quite as big a thing as climate change. It's more the kind of local level natural resources, I suppose, and the whole ecosystem and how that contributes. I wondered if anything you found on that when you were doing your research. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the question, Sarah. And I'm the bearer of bad news in the answers of the question I'm asked, but I would start by saying that we have found less specific discussions of that topic than we expected in the literature. So again, when you're going to have access to the living library, you're going to be able to, that's one of the variables you're going to be able to filter on resources that discuss not just climate change, but natural resources and natural capital and ecosystems in general. That said, there is a subset of the literature that does address that in terms of the social and economic inclusion programming, and specifically around community level management of natural resources. So management of natural resources in local economies, jointly by refugee communities and by local host communities. To some extent, in the calls for more system level interventions associated with self-reliance programming, there is also implicitly in some resources a link that is made towards thinking more deeply about natural ecosystems in relation to self-reliance programming and how supporting regenerative and ecosystems that are sustainable in refugee hosting areas is one of the factors that are conducive to better self-reliance for refugees. But this is still very much underdeveloped as a topic in terms of specific indications as to how to do that or what that would look like. I hope that to some extent answers your question, Sarah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think it's an interesting area that may need more attention. So thanks very much for that.
And thanks to all for being with us today. Maybe we can move to the next slide. Thanks. Really heartily thank you to all of you for staying with us for this presentation. We hope it was useful. We hope that you will continue the work with us. So our contacts are on the slide right now. You also have the website for the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, where you can find, among others, the Self-Reliance Index that Simmer was mentioning. So there will be more coming. If you registered for this event, you will be part of the distribution list for the brief and also for some of the events that are happening next year. Stay tuned and please continue working with us on this project. And very good evening or end of the day for all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.